Welcome, everybody. I'm back with Greg, and we are here with another virtual deck. One of my favorite janky mechanics in Star Wars CCG. So we have Hidden Base, and this is going to be one of these things you can do in this game where you scratch your head and like, why does this work? It works because the cards say it can work, and it's no less absurd than some of the stuff that wins in Magic. So, let's get into this kind of janky Hidden Base deck with virtual cards. So, Greg, what are we doing here? What's the premise?
Yeah, so I want you to imagine something, Matt. I want you to imagine you're playing your light side, you've got a system out, you throw down a little bulk freighter, and you throw a little gun on that bulk freighter, and you just leave that. And you're sitting there, you've got 3 power, you've got a little gun, you can't even draw Battle Destiny, the weapon's not even that good. Next thing you know, Darkseid comes down with the might of the Empire. They throw down an Executor. It's loaded with pilots. It's sitting there at 20 plus power. They're drawing like 3 Battle Destinies. It's got an armor of 12. It's immune to attrition. Even if you could draw Battle Destiny, you weren't going to break that attrition. They battle you, right? And it looks like all hope is lost. But before you get to the Battle Destiny phase, you take your gun and you fire it at that Executor. You draw a little 3, nothing. It doesn't look like anything happens. And yet somehow, magically, that 3 is enough to hit that Executor. You play a little power pivot. You send that Executor lost. The battle ends, and that little bulk freighter has not only survived, but it's wiped out the entire Empire's fleet.
That seems impossible.
You would think it's impossible.
It's impossible.
And yet this is what's so great about Star Wars CCG. Okay, so the objective is Hidden Base. I'm going to be talking about a particular version of it called Hidden Base Quads. So Hidden Base is this objective. And the basics of the deck are that, you are the rebels. You've got a hidden base somewhere in space, and the Empire is, scouting the galaxy, looking for you, trying to find your hidden base. And until they find your hidden base, you have a number of nice benefits that really frustrate your opponent. And so the way it works is this objective allows you to start with 1 site. That's it, nothing else. Rendezvous point, it's a 2-0 site, so you're not giving your opponent any force. And then what you do is the very first thing you do is you decide on a hidden base. So you're going to have a bunch of systems in your deck, and you're going to have sort of second copies of those systems outside of your deck, and you're going to choose one of them to be your hidden base. You're going to put that face down, you're going to slide it underneath your objective, and that's going to be your hidden base for the game. And then while the 0 side is up, the objective allows you to deploy a system each turn from the deck. And it limits your drains on the 0 side. So even if you've got sites that would normally allow you to drain 2 or 3, you can drain a max of 1 at each system while you're on the 0 side. And you flip your objective anytime you want after you've deployed up to 5 battleground systems, including your hidden base system. So that's the 0 side of the objective. Which basically just helps you get out some more systems and doesn't really give you much of a benefit at all. In fact, the only thing it really does is limit your ability to drain in space. But when you flip and you're on the 7 side, there's 2 things that are really great. One of which is that for up to 2 systems that you control, you can just cancel your opponent's force drains. So that is twice per turn. As long as you control up to 2 systems, you can cancel 2 drains, whether they're on the ground. It's drain anywhere. Yeah, okay. Whether they're it's been a while. Whether they're on the ground or in space, you can just cancel 2 of your opponent's force drains. You don't have to pay anything to do it. You just cancel them. The other thing that you get on the 7 side that actually a lot of people forget about or don't think about, which is that your opponent, at the end of their turn, when they go to their draw phase, to draw up a card from their force pile into their hand, they first have to pay a force to do so. And this is something that people forget about, but it's actually super annoying and super frustrating, because if your opponent ends a turn with, like, let's say 8 cards in their force pile, they got to pay 1 to take 1, pay 1 to take 1, pay 1 to take 1. They have to pay 4 force just to take up 4 force into their hand. And so those are the two main benefits of the 7 side. And the last thing is what your opponent can do when you're on the 7 side is they can probe to try to find your hidden base. The way they probe is during any deploy phase. So that's during your deploy phase or theirs. They can take a card from their hand, put it face down underneath a system. And if that system is your hidden base, then they have successfully probed it. And the objective is placed out of play. And if it's not a successful probe, then that card just stays underneath the system they put it at. Nothing happens. And what if they eventually try probing a bunch of unsuccessful attempts and then they get your hidden base, all those cards that they use to probe go back into their reserve deck after they've successfully probed. And so basically, until they successfully probe, you have these nice benefits. Once they successfully probe, if they ever successfully probe, then the objective is gone.
I've never been able to crack hidden base of whether I should bother probing or not. I never know. I'm like, this is so annoying. It feels like I have to, but then sometimes you're on like 4 probes and like, this is so tedious.
You should 100% probe as the dark side player. Okay. I think it's very foolish not to probe because the flip side is like so powerful that you really have a lot of incentive to probe. I will say a few things later on about potentially some strategies for the dark side to probe. So, those watching this, there's going to be some good advice for playing with hidden base, but also maybe playing against hidden base, because it's important for you as the light side hidden base player to sort of anticipate some of your opponent's more powerful strategies for probing. So I'll go over that. So that's the deck. Now, there's like a lot of possible strategies you as the light side player can engage in with this deck. That is, you can have swarm version. The idea is you're totally open with respect to the kind of space package you want to have in this deck. You can have like an X-Wing swarm deck, or one that also includes X-Wing laser cannons. You can have a B-Wing swarm deck that uses ion cannons. You can have a Y-Wing swarm deck. You can have an ARC Starfighter swarm deck. That is, you can have like tons of these and various interrupts and strategies that work with them. You can have strategies that work with pilots and their matching ships, and effects that let you pull those pilots and matching ships and deploy them together. That's a fun strategy. You can have a strategy that just focuses on like powerful or useful ships, and you just have a bunch of those. So there's like a ton of different ways to play this deck, and people should, play hidden base whichever way they want. I'm going to focus on a particular strategy called, hidden base quads, that's focused on freighters, medium bulk freighters, and lasers. But I'll say, even though the strategy that I'm going to be talking about is focused on these cards, much of what I say will carry over to other kinds of strategies as well. So that's sort of like worth thinking about if if you're thinking about playing this deck but don't want to do this particular strategy.
Is this a well-known strategy, this quad laser cannon plus medium bulk freighter, or is it sort of like something that you like to do?
I think I certainly didn't come up with it. I think I discovered it on the forums some years back, and I've really enjoyed using it. I don't know how, I haven't come against this version of the deck. I haven't played against it, so I don't know how many people play it, but also a lot of people don't really play hidden base. So, I certainly didn't create it. Is it the dominant strategy? Probably not. I have no idea. Is it something you might come across? Definitely.
Okay.
So here's the idea.
Yeah.
Sorry, say that again.
No, how do we do this?
Yeah, how does this even work? How do you have a tiny little bulk freighter that takes out the executor? Okay, so you've got these bulk freighters. They don't look like much on their own. 3 power, 4 armor, 3/4 deploy forfeit. They're a capital starship, but they move like a starfighter, and that'll be important later. You could add pilots. They only have an ability of 1. Importantly, you can deploy quad laser cannons on them. You've got the quad laser cannon. It also is like not super interesting on its own. It's got a 4 destiny. It costs 2 force to deploy, which is not great. It costs a force to target. It doesn't really have much of a bonus, right? Target hit if destiny is greater than defensive value, although you do get to add 1 if targeting a starfighter as opposed to a capital starship. So it doesn't look like much here, but there are 2 cards that are really key for this strategy, which is this Admiral's Order, taking them with us, and Corellian Engineering Corporation. And these 2 cards, combined with the bulk freighters and the quad laser cannons, create the engine of this version of the Hidden Base deck. So Corellian Engineering Corp is effect. It deploys on the Corellia system, and it does a number of different things. 1, your freighters are deploy -1 and hyperspeed +1. So that is, your freighters are now deploy for 2, hyperspeed of 5. Also, quad laser cannons deploy for free. So that card that normally costs 2 force to put out now deploys for free, and add 2 to each of your weapon destiny draws. And so now you're firing at +2 and +3 when you're targeting a starfighter. Next, you've got the taking them with us. And the taking them with us allows you to, so if you look at the text here, each player, if that player has a capital starship, which the medium bulk freighter is, armed with a starship weapon, now you draw battle destiny if unable to otherwise. So that little 3-power bulk freighter, which now comes out for 2 force, draws battle destiny on its own once it's got a gun, which is super cool, right? But the next text is that once per battle, you may reduce the defensive value of one of your opponent's capital starships by 4 for the remainder of turn. And so with that, now with the Corellian Engineering Corporation allowing your bulk freighter to fire at +2, and the taking them with us to reduce your opponent's capital starships armor defensive value by 4, you're basically firing at +6 against capital starships and +3 against regular starfighters. And now you can start seeing how this kind of package can become pretty powerful.
Okay, so we're at still not cracking the executor unless you get a 7, right?
We're still not cracking executor, so we'll get there. We'll get there. But you can see why this is nice. You've got, you know, the bulk freighter, you've got the gun. They're drawing destiny on their own. They're firing at either +6 or +3, which is enough to hit, by the way, most capital starships and most regular starfighters. And, you know, now you throw in, you know, 4 of those Admiral's Orders or so, because that's really important. There's not really a good way to pull Admiral's Orders with like other interrupts or stuff. So you want to have a number of them, a number of bulk freighters to make sure that you get them, a number of quad laser cannons, not as many quad laser cannons, and I'll explain why you don't necessarily need quite as many. The exact numbers you can play with, but certainly you want a fair number of these for your strategy. And the idea is I'm not really using any other starships or any other guns, right? And this really is the engine. Now, the starting effects that I use in this version of the deck are these 3: Wokling, a new secret base, and superficial damage. Wokling is a virtual card. So by the way, you know, all of these are non-virtual, right? So we have no virtual cards yet. Now, with these starting effects, a few of them are virtual. Wokling from Endor has been virtualized, and Wokling does a couple things that are going to be important for this deck. The first is that it gives you +1 force generation per turn. And that's going to be important, especially at the start of this game, because you're only starting with 2 force on the table. And while you're eventually going to generate quite a bit of force in this deck, having that extra force at the beginning of the game, the first turn or 2, is really nice. More importantly, though, and the real reason the Wokling is in this deck, is that once per game, you can use 3 force to take up an effect that has no deploy cost and deploys on another card. That Corellian Engineering Corporation is an effect that has no deploy cost and deploys on another card. So the idea is this Wokling allows you to guarantee, by the use of 3 force, to get that Corellian Engineering Corporation into your hand right at the very start of the game. And so that's the main function of the Wokling, is get that effect into your hand immediately. Now, the next one, a new secret base, another virtual card. This allows you to, once per turn, use 2 force to deploy a battleground system from your reserve deck. And the reason this is in here is that, so remember, hidden base, you can only flip once you have 5 systems out on the table, at least, including your hidden base. And if you are using the objective to grab a system once per turn, it's going to be, maybe until turn 5 or 6 before you can even think about flipping in this deck. And in the modern day meta, turn 5 or 6 is it's like late game. It's too late that if the earliest you can flip is already turn 5 or 6, this allows you to get out a second system per turn, allowing you to, at minimum, get 2 systems out per turn. So you can be potentially flipping at turn 2 or 3, which is a huge difference from being able to flip at turn 5 or 6. It also has some nice other text about if you just drained out a battleground system, you can draw the top card of your reserve deck. So it's a nice way to get some extra cards in your hand. But the main reason it's in here is to get those extra systems out quickly. And the last card is Superficial Damage. This is the light side version of a card that I talked about when we talked about Invasion, at least my version of the Invasion deck, which is that it turns your weapons in your deck into cards that you can forfeit for a value of 3, in which then recycle into your used pile. So if you're in a battle, you have to forfeit something for battle damage or attrition, you can take these quad laser cannons, they forfeit for a value of 3, and they recycle into your used pile, which is why I have fewer of those quad laser cannons in the deck than the bulk freighters. The bulk freighters are going lost, the quad laser cannons are being recycled. And so those are your 3 starting effects, or my 3 starting effects, which is the card that gets you the Engineering Corporation, the card that helps you get systems out, and this that allows you to recycle those weapons for a value of 3 every time.
No, I mean, I think Superficial Damage is such a cool card. It makes weapons slightly better because they're actually very crappy. Typically.
Yes. Now, important just for folks to know, both the light side and dark side version, they don't work on lightsabers, right? That would make lightsabers a bit too powerful, but any other weapons that you have in your deck, you can use this card with. And it's a fun card, and there's lots of different strategies you can use with this kind of thing. Okay. So you've got that package, you've got your starting effects. Let me say something about the systems in this deck, right? Since this is clearly a very system-heavy deck, you need at least 5 of them, which is quite a lot. Number 1, you need Corellia in this deck. This is an absolute auto-include. This is an all-include because this is what the Corellian Engineering Corporation deploys on, so you absolutely must include Corellia. There's a nice virtual version of it that I use. I like it. It gives you an extra force. The non-V Corellia is a 1/1. This is a 2/1. Got some nice little bonus text as well, but mostly it's nice because it's a 2/1 site. But you have to include some version of it for the Engineering Corporation. And then past that, that's the only really one you have to. Past that, it's kind of up to you what you want to do. There are some nice sites you can use, like Narshada, which is a 2/1 site, but it's a +1 to force drain for you. So you're only giving up 1 force icon, but it's allowing you to drain for 2. You have systems like Corulag or Geonosis that are also 2/1 sites, but they're -1 to force drain for your opponent. So if they control, they can only drain you 1 at those sites. You have other sites like Naboo and Kamino, Malachor, Kifix. These are 2/2 sites where even though you're giving up 2 force, you are also draining 2 force. And then you have sites like Tatooine that have, they're a 2/1 site, but they have some nice text that is this version of Tatooine from Coruscant limits your opponent's ability to draw battle destinies. It's kind of up to you how you want to play this. Right now in my deck, I have like a mix of 2/1 sites that allow, that mitigate my opponent's ability to drain while adding mine, and 2/2 sites. I've seen some versions that are more focused on the 2/2. In this deck, you give up so much force to your opponent. Normally it would be bad to have a lot of 2/2 sites, but given that you're already giving up so much force to your opponent in this deck, potentially just riddling it with 2/2 systems is not gonna, you're already giving your opponent so much force. What's a few extra, and you get the extra drains out of it? Sort of up to you. You can play around, play this however you want, but you want to have at least 5 systems in this deck. That's what's important.
Just want to give a shout out to the PC here. Some of this virtual card art is great. The Geonosis look dope.
Yeah, totally, right? Isn't that really beautiful?
That was great. Well done, guys.
Yeah. Okay, last thing before moving on to the early game, choosing your hidden base. That is, how do you choose which of these systems is your hidden base? This is the thing that I think frustrates players on both sides, which is this just huge element of randomness in this kind of deck. you know, there's a sense in which depends on how you're playing. Like if you're playing with a kind of a regular game, a kitchen table game with like a group of friends or something like that, what's important is that you're just not predictable. You just want to make sure that if you're playing people who know you, you're not choosing the same hidden base every time you play this deck, right? So that's like something to think about. Don't be predictable. You know, more important than that, there's this kind of question that'll come up later, which is, you know, as you're deploying your ships, and you're backing up and you're draining at your systems, what do you do? Do you make your hidden base a system that you're going to deploy to and protect with a huge force, so that at least if your opponent comes there to probe it, you're there with a huge force? Or do you put it on a system that you don't even go to at all, or where you barely cover, to kind of have a feint, you know, to think maybe your opponent won't think you're there because you've backed up another system? You know, this is like a rock, paper, scissors situation. I don't think there's like an ideal strategy at all in terms of like, do you put the hidden base where you're going to be? Do you put the hidden base where you're not going to be? I have no idea what dark side opponents coming in think you're going to do. Like, so it's like not clear what you should do in response. I will say the kind of ideal though is getting yourself in a situation where that decision never has to even arise, because you've demolished your opponent's fleet well before you even flip the objective. So that's the kind of ideal where you have demolished your opponent's space force, and by the time you flip your objective, they can't even probe at all. But given non-ideal situations where you have to flip before, you know, I don't have a perfect strategy. You know, it's kind of a coin toss here, I think. Okay.
Oh no, go on.
So, you know, with that, you know, moving into the early game, let's think about like how to set up this flip, right? How to set up this strategy. So it's turn one, you've got your objective, you've got your 3 starting effects, you've got rendezvous point, right? The first thing you do is you use your hidden base, you grab Corellia. Now, while you're looking for Corellia, by the way, note, you should be looking to see if Corellian Engineering Corporation is in your deck. Assuming it's in your reserve deck, you want to right away use your Wokling and grab Corellian Engineering Corporation and get that into your hand, and then put it down on the system, right? This is really important for you to grab quickly. If it's not in your reserve deck, by the way, when you grab Corellia at the beginning, that means it's in your force pile. You want to then either use all your force or take up all your force, because you want to get that out of your force pile so you could at least find it the next turn. Because again, this is such a key card for your deck. You do not want it stuck in your force pile. So you've got Corellia out, you put the Engineering Corporation on it, you use your a new secret base to grab some other site. First turn, I'll usually grab some 2/1 sites if I've got them, to limit the amount of force I'm giving my opponent, at least on the first turn. And honestly, that's your first turn. You're not really doing much else. I mean, notice just grabbing the Engineering Corporation and pulling the second system is already 5 force, and you're not even guaranteed that 5 force, because you start with 4 with the Wokling and the force for you. So you even have to be given a force to be able to pull a second system, the Corellian Engineering Corporation. So, you know, there's very little you can do beyond grabbing these 2 cards. There's no reason to really deploy. Your drain is limited to 1. You're exposing yourself early. It's more important to build your hand. There's no need to save force at this point, really. So get these systems out, get the Corellian Engineering Corporation out. Turn 2, get more systems out. That is, use your hidden base again to deploy another site. Use the new secret base to deploy another site. And, you know, maybe you got lucky and you drew another one, and you've managed to get out 5 of these sites by turn 2, and you're kind of ready to flip here, right? Which is not to say that you've flipped yet, but the idea is you can get, you know, enough sites out pretty quickly by turn 2, and you're kind of ready to go. I will say one important thing at this point. Now, I only use 5 total systems in my deck, so this is sort of it. But you do need to be careful of that, and some people play more than 5 systems for the following reason. If you are force drained before you have your 5 systems out, and you lose one of those systems, you can never flip if you only have 5 systems in your deck. And so some people play more than 5 systems to be able to potentially lose one by mistake before they're ready to flip. I only play 5, but what that means is that if I have to lose any force whatsoever before I'm ready to flip, I lose that from my hand, not from my reserve deck. Because the absolute worst thing that can happen in this deck is you lose your 5th system, and then you are unable to flip the objective to the 7 side.
Yeah, and I guess there's not really much retrieval in this, so you're just screwed. I guess Wokling you can throw out for one.
You can. So if you are drained 1 and you lose that 1 from your reserve and it happens to be the system, you can expend the Wokling's last bit of text there, which is to place the effect out of play to retrieve a force. You do have to be careful then, because let's say you have to lose 2 force, and you lose the first one from your reserve deck, and it's the system. You can't use Wokling right away. You have to lose that second force, and then that system's buried. So you could potentially lose 1 from your hand and then 1 from your reserve. Hope it's not the system, and if it is, use Wokling to get it back. But just be very, very careful in this deck about losing force unseen until you've got your 5 systems.
Okay, so we've got 5 systems.
You've got your 5 systems, and then, it's kind of up to you what to do at this point. There's like a lot of different ways to go about it. You can kind of wait and see what your opponent's doing. I'm not sure you would definitely do this yet. But one thing you can potentially do, and just for illustrating the deck, is you can throw out a bulk freighter, for 2 force here. You can throw a gun on it for free. If you've got in your Admiral's order, by the way Admiral's orders work is you can't put them down until you have a ship present at a system. So you can't put that AO down first and then a ship. So only once you have the ship can you place the Admiral's order down. And so, but a good potentially, depending on what your opponent's doing, if you've got things to respond to, whatever, blah blah blah, this is like not a bad move to do. It doesn't cost you much force as long as you're going to be able to protect it. I will say normally I would put this at a 2/2 site, especially if I'm about to flip. I'm just putting it here at Corulag just to illustrate so it doesn't cover up too much. Okay, so you've got this out. You could potentially flip at this point. Now the question is, because that is, you've got your 5 battlegrounds, your hidden base is one of them. You can flip at any time you want. It's up to you. When do you flip in hidden base? Now, this is a really hard question to answer. The answer is like kind of depends. Now, remember that the flip side is really nice, because when you're flipped, you can cancel up to 2 of your opponent's drains on the ground, for instance, right? And at the same time, you're making it really difficult for your opponent to replenish their hand because they have to pay force to retrieve force. So there's a lot of incentive to flip because you're removing your opponent's drains and you're just making it very hard for them to replenish their hand after they're doing stuff. However, as soon as you flip, your opponent can start probing, right? And of course, the ideal situation is that you don't flip until you've demolished your opponent's space fleet, right? But this is often really difficult to accomplish. And this is especially difficult if your opponent is like draining you hard on the ground and there's a lot of incentive for you to start kind of mitigating that. And so when to flip really depends on context. I will say generally the strategy is it's good to wait until you've beaten down some of your opponent's space fleet, but sometimes you're forced into doing it earlier because you just can't handle the drain that's being thrown at you. So again, not a hard and fast rule, but keep those kinds of things in mind when you're thinking about flipping. Before you're ready to flip, a couple things to think about. You can mitigate damage on the ground before you flip without the objective. That is, you can use something like Jyn Erso, right, an undercover spy, and put her down somewhere to mitigate a drain. A lot of people use these projections of a Skywalker card, which you deploy at a planet site, and opponent's force drains are -1 there. So these are cards that a lot of people use to mitigate drains on the ground until they're ready to flip. So just keep these kinds of cards in mind. They're really useful. But putting the mitigation on the ground aside, what do you need to do to win in space? Basically, you want to be just thinking about, at least my version of this, thinking about interrupts that help with your bulk freighter quad laser cannon strategy. So you asked me before, how am I taking out the Executor? That +6 is great, that +3 is great. That's not exactly taking out something like Executor. Well, if you want to take out the Executor, or if you just want to really ensure that you do not miss when you fire, Steady Aim is a nice card, adds 2 to your weapon destiny when you use it as used, 4 as lost. You have cards like Power Pivot, which if you've just hit an opponent's starship, sends that ship immediately to the lost pile. And if that's the only ship on the table or at the system, the battle is over. You have things like Hit and Run, which are really nice. So after the weapon segment of the battle, you can move away all of your starships. So let's say you don't have that Power Pivot in hand, you hit your opponent's starship, but you're still going to go to the damage segment and they've got you massively overpowered. When you fire, you hit them, you run away, and the battle is now canceled, but that ship is now still going to be lost, right? So these kinds of things are really useful. You want to think about these kinds of interrupts. You also want to think about interrupts like maybe stay sharp, which allow you to fire a weapon during your control phase. Rebel barriers are really useful for, keeping your opponent from moving either to you or away from you. On target is a fun one. If you've got a capital starship armed with a weapon, you can use 2 force, target an opponent's starship. It's kind of like a rebel barrier in the sense that it can't move, although you don't have to do it when it's been just deployed. But not only can it not move, but its pilots don't add their ability towards drawing battle destiny. So you could potentially have a situation where your opponent has a capital starship and suddenly they can't draw battle destiny and they can't move. And so on target is a fun one as well. I don't have a ton, I have a few of each of these, right, kinds of cards. I don't have a huge stock of interrupts. This is mostly what I have in the deck. The real trick is like figuring out how to use these cards effectively, especially to protect your hidden base as long as possible. And so sort of just to run through this, and this is this question you asked earlier about like, should the dark side probe? The dark side should definitely probe. And when you're playing a smart dark side player, what they're going to do is they're going to try to maximize their probes as much as possible in like as short a time as possible. So for instance, the opponent might like take 2 different ships, deploy one to Kifix, one to Corulag, probe both of those systems, and then move both of those ships away to Nar Shaddaa to be ready to probe during the next deploy phase. Because remember, it's probing once per turn, and that's both on the light side's turn and the dark side's turn. So by deploying those 2 ships and then moving them, you can probe 3 sites in 1 round. Or they could even potentially deploy one to Kifix, one to Corulag, probe at both of those, move each of them away to a different site, a different system, and now be ready to probe 4 systems in 1 round. Or the other way, they can deploy to Nar Shaddaa and Tatooine, probe both of those, and then move to where you are, right? So the dark side can engage in these different strategies to kind of really maximize the number of systems they can probe in one go. And one thing you want to be thinking about here is using cards like your on target or your rebel barrier to stop them from moving, right? So let's say they've come to where you are, and that's not where the hidden base is, right? You can use a rebel barrier and on target to keep them where you are, so they don't have the opportunity to move away and probe to where the hidden base is, right? Or the reverse strategy. They go somewhere else where you're not, and they're about to probe there and then move to where you are. You can use, and that's where your hidden base is, you can use these cards to keep them there. And so, often people use Rebel Barrier to sort of keep the opponent from battling them in a turn. In this deck, you're kind of using these cards to keep them where they are, either so they can't move to probe your hidden base, or if they end up getting lucky and they are probing your hidden base, stop them from moving so they can't run away from that hidden base. But that's the kind of thing you want to be thinking about here.
Because I guess like you have to win this through force drains, right? Like you're not going to have a decisive battle where you're going to blow, like you're going to hit a ship, but it's still going to have a forfeit value, right? Like you're not going to have overflow damage.
That's correct. You rarely ever have overflow damage in this deck. Either you hit the ship and then you power pivot and make it go lost, but they've lost the cards, but there's no overflow. Or it still has its forfeit value, in which case not only is there not overflow, but you might be losing your ships in the process, right? And so you're not winning this deck via battle damage overflow. You're winning with this deck via drains. That is draining in space and keeping your opponent from draining at the ground, so you win that drain race. And so it's really, and that's why it's really important to keep your opponent from probing successfully. You want to just make that mitigation last as long as possible is the idea. One other actually interrupt that I use in this deck, it's a rapid fire. This is a nice one. If a battle is just initiated, you can deploy for free a weapon, either from hand or reserve deck. This is nice because think about your weapons that you're recycling. You have a battle, you forfeit that weapon, it goes to your use pile, it then gets recycled into your reserve deck. You've got a rapid fire in your hand that next turn, if your opponent battles you, or you can initiate a battle, right? This works either way. You can play this interrupt, grab that weapon out of the reserve, or if you drew it during your draw phase last turn, and deploy it right back. And so rapid fire is a fun card. It's a 5 destiny used interrupt, so it's like worth throwing in for that reason. So those are the interrupts, right? That's your kind of early game, is setting up, thinking about how to win those battles in space, right? How to, how to handle this kind of situation. And then, the mid-game strategy ideally is, you drain and your opponent doesn't. That is, you just pepper space. You don't really need in this deck, because you're trying to shoot your opponent's starships down. You're trying to run away from battles. You're trying to get rid of them. Make sure you've got some Houjix in your hand. If you can't run away and you can't get rid of your opponent's starship, to at least hit it and then use your Houjix to soak up battle damage. But the idea is you're not loading up a bunch of bulk freighters in space. You are focusing on spreading and draining, and then again mitigating your opponent's force drains. But you have to be careful here. I mean, notice you've got this spread. This is really great. You're draining for 6 to 8 force in space. You're canceling your opponent's drains on the ground. And just obviously a few turns of that can be really powerful. A few turns of draining 6 or 8 while your opponent drains nothing or just 2 is going to be obviously huge. The thing you need to worry about, though, is your opponent's going to be playing, if you're playing shields, your opponent's going to play something like Battle Order, right? They're going to play the shield. Unless you occupy both systems and on the ground, you're going to be paying 3 force to drain at each of these systems. And that's going to be really hard to do. If you're trying to drain 6 or 8 force across all these different systems, you need to pay 9 or 12 force every turn to do that, which is totally unsustainable because you can't do anything else if that's what's going on. So you do want to have some sort of strategy to think about what to do on ground. And most hidden base decks have very little ground force, and it's usually a small targeted thing. So you can do something like some splashable EPPs. Obi with Saber, Quiggy, Luke with Saber, Rey with Saber, things like this, coupled with some interrupts like Clash of Sabers, right? Once you've hit, to send a character, to remove them from battle, and send them to the lost pile. Sorry about the mess, to put into the lost pile once you've hit them. A small package like this can be useful. A package that just has a mix of good cards, like maybe an EPP, but you're, screaming Lando that adds a battle destiny, a Chewie with Bowcaster who's got this great weapon, your Rey, which is just a really nice card, adds to attrition, lets you draw cards from your use pile, your Solo that adds a battle destiny with Rey or Chewie, right? Things like this. But I will say, no matter which of these strategies you choose, your goal is not to control on the ground, and it's not to battle on the ground. Your goal is to occupy for as long as possible to get around that shield so you don't have to pay to drain. So you're not coming down and trying to battle and clear sites. You're coming down and just trying to survive as long as possible on the ground. And a card like It's a Trap is a super useful card for this, because the lost text allows you to use 3 force to cancel any battle just initiated. So the idea is you put down your cards, you're not battling, you wait. Ideally, you've got It's a Trap. Your opponent's next turn, they try to battle you. You play It's a Trap to cancel that battle, so you survive one more turn on the ground, right? To not have to pay for drains in space. So the goal for these guys is just to mitigate those drains. And It's a Trap is a really wonderful card to do that with. Be careful. There is a card from Coruscant that cancels It's a Trap. You see it semi-regularly because it also cancels Rebel Barrier or Smokescreen, which are semi-popular cards. Rebel Barrier is obviously a popular card, so Smokescreen gets used as well. So you do want to be careful that It's a Trap can be canceled. You want to make sure you're not fully depending on it. Playing a Houjix or 2 in your deck can be really helpful for both space and ground in this regard, so you don't get any overflow if you lose your cards on the ground. One last thing to note, if you play Solo, Solo's got this really, really wonderful text. Once per game, they play an interrupt from Lost Pile as if from hand, and then place that card out of play. Here's a really fun and annoying thing to do, right? You've got your cards on the ground. You play It's a Trap to cancel a battle destiny. That card goes to your Lost Pile. You've survived another turn. You drain for free a second turn. Your opponent initiates battle again. You use Solo's text to grab that It's a Trap again and play it one more time. So you get a double usage out of It's a Trap and stay on the ground a couple turns longer, which is a very fun and annoying strategy, which just couples well with the fun and annoying strategy of Hidden Base. 2 other cards, character cards that are worth using or thinking about. I use this Luke Skywalker in my deck. It's a virtual Luke Skywalker instead of that EPP. The main reason I use this is because during your control phase, if piloting at a battleground, you can retrieve a force. And so you get Luke out and you're retrieving 1 force a turn while he sits in space. And some folks use Baragwin as well, potentially instead of that superficial damage, which allows you to get weapons out of your lost pile, right? And so these are 2 cards you should also think about using as well, character cards. And again, some use Baragwin instead of the superficial damage, and you could also potentially couple it with the superficial damage. That's almost it. We're almost done. I just want to point out 2 cards that I think folks should watch out for in this deck. They're both virtual cards. If you're not playing virtual cards, then this might not be an issue. If you are, there's 2 important cards to watch out for. One is this Persona of Thrawn that allows the dark side player to lose 1 force to cancel a just drawn weapon destiny targeting a starship he's piloting. So now this is not necessarily a card you're going to see a lot, but it is a card you might see, and it's a killer for your strategy because you shoot the starship in space, they use a force, cancel that weapon destiny, and the starship remains. Now, if you've got 2 or 3 bulk freighters at the same site, you can shoot 2 or 3 times, and they have to lose quite a bit of force to keep canceling your weapon destinies, but it's probably worth it for them to do that. To keep those ships in space. So FYI, watch out for that. Obviously, that only works for the ship Thrawn is on. It doesn't work for other ships, but keep an eye out for that. Security precautions is another frustrating one, especially because it's a relatively popular card for dark side players to start, because like Wokling, it gives the dark side player +1 force generation. And this one, once per game, allows the dark side to restore a just hit starship to normal. And so you hit them, and then it just becomes unhit. Now, that's only once per game, but you do need to watch out for that. So if you see security precautions, you want to come down with like 2 bulk freighters to hit the starship, they restore it, and then you shoot again, right? Also really frustrating, though, and a real killer for this deck is that your Corellian Engineering Corporation is suspended unless you occupy a battleground site. And as you can see in this deck, it can be quite difficult to occupy battleground sites for more than a few turns in this deck. So security precautions, every time I see it, it's not necessarily an auto loss, but it's definitely a huge frustration to play against in this deck.
It's kind of wild because I feel like this is kind of an obscure strategy, right? To have a card that feels like it is a killer for Bulk Freight. Like this general, I mean, even like the Corellian Engineering Corps, it just feels like this was designed to counter this strategy.
Yeah, I feel targeted. And maybe it is. And yeah, because it's that +1, it just ends up being a kind of a good utility card for DS players. I don't know how many of them are thinking they're going to come up against Hidden Base, but it's certainly a bonus when they do. And it's certainly a killer for this particular version of Hidden Base that's relying on Corellian Engineering Corporation, right? And weapons. Not every version of Hidden Base is going to be equally hurt by this. This version of Hidden Base is very hurt by this. And that's it. That's the deck here. So, you've got these bulk freighters, you've got these laser cannons, you got a bunch of jank thrown in to help you hit, even the most powerful of your opponent's starships. And, this is like a kind of bobbing and weaving deck until you can control space. And then it can be really powerful because, again, just a couple turns of draining 6 or 8 force while mitigating Jane's on the ground, that's just a huge game shifter.
Well, I think the other thing as well is once Hidden Base is flipped, it is so hard for your opponent to get cards into his hand.
Yeah.
It is just so challenging and so frustrating. You have to pay 1 force to draw a card. And even with insane force generation, like, oh, I have 15 force. I had to spend 7 to get 7 cards to replenish my hand. And it just is absolutely killer.
Yeah, that's right. If the dark side wants to like deploy some things and battle and replenish their hand, it becomes very difficult. And I mentioned this is the thing that a lot of people forget. They're always focusing on the drains, which are clearly powerful, but that force, use that you have to do to replenish your hand is like just as much of a killer for your opponent being able to do what they want to do. So this is like a weird deck. It's a janky deck, but it can be a quite powerful deck. It's also clearly got some limitations, especially given that once your opponent successfully probes, your life can be very difficult in this deck.
I just want to throw out that the medium bulk freighter might be like top 10 ugliest cards. Ships and characters. It's just an ugly CGI. Like I get what it is. It's just not a great looking card.
Well, if anyone from the PC is watching and you're thinking about releasing some cool new AI art, the Bulk Freighter seems like a really great target for all 4 of us that play this deck.
I guess one of the bonuses of Corellia is freighters deploy -1 there. That's kind of nice.
Yeah, freighters deploy -1 there, and your ships are hyperspeed +1. You know, you're not. I should also say, Rendezvous Point has this nice text too, where your starships deploy -2 there and are hyperspeed +2. And you know, there are like versions of this deck where you kind of deploy to Rendezvous Point and then move over, and you can still do that. Like, don't forget to take advantage of those things. Like, you deploy for -2 and then move to potentially. I mean, the version you're seeing here, it's, you know, their hyperspaces of 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's not going to help you at Rendezvous Point too much. But depending on which systems you use, you can potentially take advantage of those deploy modifiers. But that's not really going to, you know, change your strategy, I think, very much in this deck at all. Especially because, you know, you rarely are deploying to something like Rendezvous Point and then moving over. You often want to come down right where your opponent is or something like that. But yeah, there is this text. Don't forget, there's lots of fun text. There's lots of things I didn't mention to dig into about this deck. And of course, as always, I'll have my deck list that'll have cards that I haven't talked about.
This looks a lot of fun. I hope people clog Gemp up with some janky decks.
Nothing would make me happier than seeing something like this. You know, these, you know, jank invasions versus jank hidden base suddenly become very popular.
Like, what has happened to our game? It's just, yeah, cheese. Well, thanks for hanging out, Greg. We're going to be back with some more of these. These are really fun to do. It's fun to sort of dive into the open format a little bit with virtual cards, but also keeping a lot of familiar things and showing the synergies that, you know, half this deck, actually probably more than half, 3/4 of this deck is very doable, which is Decipher cards up to like DS2 or even
yeah, it's a cheap deck to make if you're making it physically. I think it's definitely also pretty Decipher heavy with the cards, right? There are clearly virtual cards in here, but it's not overloaded with virtual cards at all. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. So it's an accessible deck, and you know, for those who are getting into virtual cards, you know, I don't think the barrier is going to be that difficult. And some of the virtual choices I make are not required. Some I think are, like the starting effects, but some are pretty optional. So, you know, it's up to you how you want to play it.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks for hanging out, Greg. Like, subscribe. If you want some requests, put them in the comments. We're always open to ideas. This has been a lot of fun, but we'll catch you guys later.